Three Vikings brothers, bound by blood yet utterly distinct in character. That's precisely what we discover when we peel back the layers of Viking history and examine the Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian peoples during that extraordinary era. The world often lumps them together as one homogeneous force of northern warriors. But the truth is far more nuanced and fascinating. Yes, they shared common roots and cultural threads, but their stories, their choices, and their legacies diverged in ways that still echo through Scandinavia today. Let's begin with Denmark, and I'll be honest, the Danes were arguably the most formidable Vikings of them all. They operated on a scale that dwarfed most other raiders. While others launched opportunistic strikes, the Danes orchestrated campaigns of conquest and settlement that reshaped entire nations. England and France bore the brunt of their ambition. The Danelaw wasn't just a temporary foothold, it was an entire region of England under Danish dominion. Later, all of England fell under Danish rule for a period. Then there's Normandy, where the Danes raided the French coast so relentlessly that the French crown essentially surrendered northern France to them just to stop the bleeding. 2 centuries later, those same Normans, descendants of Danish Vikings, crossed the Channel and conquered England yet again. The English found themselves on the losing end twice in one age, not to mention earlier migrations that flooded the island with Danish genetics. If you trace English ancestry far enough back, you'll find it's overwhelmingly Danish, unlike the Welsh, Scots, and Irish who retained their Celtic heritage. Denmark produced the era's most legendary figures. King Knut ruled all of England. Sweyn Forkbeard stood defiantly against Christianization and overthrew his own father, Harald Bluetooth, whose name you probably recognize from your devices. And of course, there's Ragnar and his sons, whose exploits have captivated imaginations for centuries. To understand the Danish Vikings deeply, you'd turn to the Gesta Danorum or examine foreign chronicles like French Annals, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, or Bede's History of the English People. These primary sources give you unfiltered perspectives without modern reinterpretation. What makes Denmark's achievements even more remarkable is the context. While projecting power across the North Sea, the Danes simultaneously defended their homeland against the might of the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne tested them, and later Otto I and Otto II of Germany pressed harder. They even had to fend off Norwegian raiders who struck without discrimination. The Danes juggled more responsibilities than any other Scandinavian people and left the deepest mark on European history. But success came with a price. Denmark integrated with Christian Europe far sooner than its neighbors. Danish settlers in England and France assimilated rapidly, often within 1 or 2 generations. Their genetic legacy spread like wildfire and persists to this day across northern France and England. But their religion and culture faded quickly in those lands. Compare this to Norwegian settlements in Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Scotland, and the Isle of Man, where Norse religion and culture endured for centuries and left traces visible even now, 1,000 years later. Think of Denmark as the eldest brother, the responsible one who achieved wealth and status by adapting to the changing world. This brother constantly urged his younger siblings to grow up, to stop clinging to the old ways. He'd say something like, "The rest of the world has moved on. They have Christianity, they have order, they have stable societies. And you too, you just want to keep drinking and brawling in the woods. You're embarrassing me in front of my civilized friends." Meanwhile, Norway and Sweden would just laugh and tell him where he could shove his advice. Now let's turn to Norway, the problem child of the family. If Denmark was the eldest brother, Norway was definitely the youngest, the wild one who couldn't stay out of trouble. Before the Viking Age, Norway existed more as a concept than a unified entity. We have detailed records of Denmark and Sweden during earlier periods, but Norway was fragmented into countless small tribes and kingdoms, separated by brutal terrain and dense forests. It was almost a throwback to how Germanic peoples lived 1,000 years earlier during Roman times. While civilization and centralized power took hold in Germany, Denmark, and Sweden, Norway remained a patchwork of wild communities in the woods, leaning more toward hunting and gathering than the agricultural societies developing elsewhere. Everything changed when Harald Fairhair emerged to unify the country. This moment shaped Norway's trajectory for the next millennium because it created a stark divide. For thousands of years, Norwegians had lived as free, untamed people. Then suddenly, one man imposed unified rule over everyone. Now, if you've read the sagas, you'll know Harald wasn't entirely villainous. If you pledged loyalty, brought gifts, and fought for him, he treated you well. He'd grant you land and freedom and protection. But if you opposed him or disagreed, he'd make your existence miserable through laws, restrictions, and persecution, or worse, he'd try to eliminate you entirely. Harald ruled for over 70 years, nearly half the entire Viking Age, and his sons inherited his oppressive tendencies. The result was predictable. Anyone who truly valued freedom left. They sailed to Iceland, Scotland, Ireland, Greenland, and countless other places. Norway hemorrhaged its most independent spirits, and frankly, the same pattern continues today. Norwegian Vikings were explorers and raiders first, settlers second. Unlike the Danes who arrived in massive forces to conquer cities like Paris and York, Norwegians traveled in smaller bands and struck everywhere. They didn't discriminate. They'd raid the next town over or their own neighbors if opportunity presented itself. You won't find most Norwegian raids documented in mainstream chronicles because they targeted smaller villages and towns rather than major centers. Many of these encounters weren't even violent, contradicting the popular narrative of pillage and rape and fire. To really understand Norwegian Vikings, you need to read the Icelandic sagas and the later sections of Heimskringla about the Norwegian kings. So we have Denmark as the big responsible brother, and Norway as the young wild one. The Danes faced overpopulation and resource scarcity, which drove them to settle in larger numbers in contested territories like England and Normandy, where security required strength in numbers. Norway didn't suffer the same population pressures, but had a freedom crisis. Norwegians left in smaller groups and sought uninhabited lands where they could live without rulers dictating their lives. Then came Olaf Tryggvason, perhaps the worst king Norway ever endured. He made Harald Fairhair look gentle by comparison. Olaf didn't just demand submission, he tortured and murdered anyone who refused Christianity. The horror stories are difficult to comprehend, but Olaf had help. He bribed and converted greedy noblemen with support from Otto II of the Holy Roman Empire. Norwegians, even with Danish allies, couldn't defeat the combined forces of their own compromised king backed by imperial resources. But then something extraordinary happened. Instead of fighting amongst themselves as they'd done since time immemorial, the Scandinavians united. Svein Forkbeard of Denmark, Eirik Gonson of Norway, and King Olaf of Sweden brought their forces together for the Battle of Svolder, where every remaining pagan in Scandinavia confronted Olaf Tryggvason at sea. Despite his Roman backing, Olaf stood no chance against a united Scandinavia. No army ever has when these people join forces on their own soil, which is precisely why external powers have always sought to divide them using their own treacherous rulers. A few details from this battle illuminate the differences between these nations beautifully. When Olaf realized he faced armies from all three countries, he assessed each threat. Seeing the Danes, he declared they were forest goats without courage, especially at sea, claiming Danes had never won a naval battle. Looking at the Swedes, he mocked them as horse eaters who'd have an easier time licking their sacrificial bulls than boarding his ship. But when he spotted the Norwegian fleet, his demeanor changed completely. He told his men to forget the Swedes, ignore the Danes, and focus everything on the Norwegians because they were the real danger. Warriors like himself, even vastly outnumbered and facing three nations, Olaf only feared the Norwegians. This brings us to Sweden, the middle child. The Swedes were like that brother who excelled at everything in youth, the best student, the best athlete, everyone's favorite. Much like Sweden dominated everything before the Viking Age. But as this brother matured, he grew tired of constant competition and started seeking deeper meaning. Maybe he traveled the world, studied philosophy, even became spiritual for a while. When he returned home, he chose to live peacefully compared to his brothers, though he'd always step up to fight when truly necessary. The Swedes played the most crucial role in preserving Scandinavian religion and culture, even if their deeds aren't extensively documented in Viking Age sources. We have thousands of pages about Norwegian and Danish exploits, but relatively little about Swedish activities during this period. However, before the Viking Age, Sweden was the dominant power. Nearly every major battle, event, hero, and legend originated there or involved Swedish champions. During the migration period, the Goths who swept through Eastern and Southern Europe in massive numbers came from Sweden originally. Pre-Viking Age Sweden led in warfare, technology, and societal development, confirmed by sources like Heimskringla and Beowulf, and supported by archaeological evidence showing Sweden's advancement over Denmark, and especially over Norway in weapons, agriculture, and technology. But something shifted during the Viking Age. The sagas and chronicles suggest Sweden became more peaceful, more civilized, more religious. They didn't settle or explore as extensively as Danes or Norwegians. Swedes did venture east into Eastern Europe and settle there. We just lack detailed records. Olaf Tryggvason's comments and sources like Adam of Bremen's description of Uppsala, even Ibn Fadlan's observations about the Rus Vikings who were likely Swedish, all paint Sweden as a people deeply invested in spirituality and pagan worship, far more than their neighbors. While Norwegians and Danes let their native traditions erode, Sweden maintained robust pagan practice well into the late Viking Age and beyond, even after official Christianization. Archaeologically, most of the figurines, runestones, and graves that teach us about Norse paganism come from Sweden. We found a Buddha statue there, suggesting Swedish travelers brought Eastern spiritual influences home and perhaps moderated their warrior culture with contemplative practices. This is why I'm personally grateful for Sweden's path during this era. Most existing sources and evidence about actual pagan practice, not just mythology, but real religious observance, comes from Sweden. The myths survived through Iceland, but the practice survived through Sweden. Archaeological finds, burial customs, runestones, written accounts like Adam of Bremen's, even the Frostathing law codes and folk tales are predominantly Swedish. Starting in the 1500s, we find grimoires, spell books called Svartkonspåkar documenting magical practices and folk traditions, many dating back to pagan times. For anyone interested in Viking-era religion, roughly 90% of our gratitude belongs to Sweden. Danes and Norwegians were too occupied with fighting and settlement to document their spiritual practices thoroughly, but the Swedes, being more contemplative, left us the evidence we need to reconstruct ancient Nordic religion. So here's the complete picture. Denmark was the oldest, most responsible brother who became wealthy and successful by integrating into mainstream society and contemporary norms. This brother constantly tried to convince his younger siblings to organize their lives and modernize. Norway was the youngest child, the wild one who did whatever he pleased and caused chaos for everyone. But this youngest brother went through rough times, like being sent to military school around age 10 to learn discipline. That's what the unified Norwegian kingdom did. It imposed structure and civilization on Norway, taming the wild child somewhat. Yet even with that forced discipline, this brother grew up to be a fierce individualist. Sweden was the middle child, the one who excelled at everything in youth, but eventually grew weary of competition and began seeking deeper meaning. This brother traveled the world, explored spirituality, maybe even lived as a monk briefly. Upon returning home, he committed to a peaceful, contemplative existence compared to his siblings, but always remained ready to defend his brothers when circumstances demanded it. These are the fundamental differences that emerge between the three Viking nations when you immerse yourself in the original sources. There are countless other distinctions to discover, but these are the patterns that appear most prominently in the chronicles and sagas. The evidence is there waiting for anyone curious enough to look. Three brothers from the same bloodline, each choosing their own path through one of history's most transformative eras, each leaving a unique mark that shapes their descendants even now.